Hello and kia ora. Welcome to everyone joining us for this webinar on fairness in talent assessment, specifically looking at how we navigate diversity, equity and inclusion challenges in Australia and New Zealand. Now, while this might not be the trendiest or sexiest topic, it is an important one nevertheless, not only because DE&I is a moral imperative, but also it provides a strategic advantage to those organizations that get it right. However, one of the main challenges we're all undoubtedly facing is ensuring that our recruitment and development initiatives are in fact free from bias and fair to all. And today we'll specifically be looking at the fairness of workplace personality assessments. One of the key takeaways for those of you already using assessments will be some practical tips on how to ensure that the current tool or tools that you're using is fair. And for those of you not using assessments, possibly because you're concerned that the use of assessments could serve to only perpetuate bias, we hope that this webinar provides you with an alternative perspective to consider. So you'll see on the screen that there are three presenters for today's webinar. I'm up first. My name is Desiree Grant. Those that like me call me Des, and I'm one of the directors at Peterberry Consultancy, or PBC. I'm also joined by Elise and Anne-Marie, but I'll hand over to them to introduce themselves. Elise?
Hi, so I'm Elise Dobdub, and I am the director of the product innovation team at Hogan Assessments, and I'm happy to talk to you today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anne-Marie, and I'm a senior consultant in Hogan's international team. I focus on accelerating Hogan assessment in Asia Pacific. And thank you so much, PBC and Elise, for joining us. Elise is joining us directly from the US. And thank you, Des, for having the two of us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward to it. Thank you both. In terms of the agenda and what we'll be covering just under the next hour, so we'll be having a quick look at fairness and the fairness landscape in Australia and New Zealand and why this topic is important. Anne-Marie will then take us through why personality is such a useful measure for workplace success, specifically looking at the Hogan assessments. And then we'll also provide you with questions that you could and should be asking your current test provider to ensure that the assessments that your candidates are undertaking are indeed fair for all. Elise will then take us through some statistics on fairness in Australia and New Zealand. Please don't be put off by the term. I promise you it's far more interesting than it sounds. And we'll certainly leave some time at the end for Q&A. But if you do have any questions, please feel free to send them through in the chat box, and we'll be monitoring them as we go. You would have heard in the introduction that we're from two different organizations, so PBC and Hogan. I'm keen to just provide a quick overview on the two organizations and how we work together, as I'm aware that some of you might be new to us on the call today. So Hogan was founded in 1987 in the US by Drs. Joyce and Robert Hogan. Hogan Assessment Systems pioneered the use of personality assessment to improve workplace performance. They then went on to become the first to demonstrate personality's impact on organizational effectiveness. Their personality assessments are probably the best triangulation of personality in the market. And to date, they've assessed over 1 million people worldwide. 11 million people worldwide. PBC was founded by MD Peterberry, the man himself, and we're a proud distributor of the Hogan Assessments in Australia and New Zealand. We do also publish our own suite of tools, such as the Hogan 360, High Performing Teams Assessment, Employee Opinion and Safety Surveys. And we have over 30 years experience in coaching and delivering best practice solutions to maximize the potential of individuals, teams, leaders, and organizations. And both organizations share the view that success in the workplace should be accessible to all, rather than just a select few. So it's worth starting this webinar by having a look at the macro view of diversity, equity, and inclusion before we delve into assessments specifically. So what are we seeing in Australia and New Zealand? 12 years ago, Forbes published an article showing the global diversity ranking, and this index shows the most diverse labour forces, of which New Zealand and Australia were ranked second and fourth consecutively. Norway came in at first, but it's worth noting that this is due to high rates of gender diversity. The Norwegian government at the time had put in place quotas that ensured that there was female representation in leadership positions across all publicly listed organizations. So it's fair to say that New Zealand and Australia did fairly well in the absence of such quotas. Fast forward 10 years to 2021. And what we see on this slide is the results of a study conducted by the Pew Research Center that had a look at 17 of the most advanced economies at the time. And the large majority of people surveyed said that having people from many different ethnic backgrounds actually made their countries better. New Zealand and Australia once again ranked highly, with 88% of Kiwis and 85% of Aussies holding the view that diversity makes us better and makes the country a better place to live. If we then narrow our perspective from a country view to an organization view, we see that these are the results from a 2023 Randstad study that showed that 90% of HR leaders in Australia confirmed that DE&I is embedded in their talent strategy, which is actually higher than the global average of 81%. 75% of respondents in Australia and New Zealand said that they had budget for DE&I initiatives, with 45% saying that this budget is likely to increase in the next fiscal year. Now, while the majority of organizations have DEI strategies in place, only 2/3 of them actually had budget. So it's one thing to have a strategy, it's quite another to have a monetary backing to roll that strategy out. So why do we have DE&I initiatives? The most obvious reason is in order to address historic disparities. And secondly, it's important for organizations to align their corporate values with employee values. We're increasingly seeing members of folks from Gen Z employees refusing to stay at organizations or even applying for jobs at companies where the corporate values don't align with their personal values. And so in order to attract and retain future talent, this is becoming quite imperative to do. And thirdly, it's about finding exceptional talent in underrepresented groups. So how are we tracking, you might ask? We'll see that across Australian and New Zealand organizations, about 1/3 of all positions are held by women or those that identify as female. In terms of ethnic diversity, we have 5% of all leaders in Australia being of non-Caucasian ethnicity, and 15% of leaders in New Zealand being of non-Caucasian ethnicity. And then looking at the gender pay gap, Australia's gender pay gap is 13%. And this really means that for every dollar on average that men earned, women earned 87 cents. And for New Zealand, the pay gap is 8.6%. So it's fair to say that we still have quite a way to go. But there are various organizations that are trying to address this. And an example of this that we're starting to see more and more frequently is actually at the front end of recruitment processes, where they highlight some of this research and some findings in job ads. And the research shows that men tend to apply for jobs where they meet on average about 60% of the criteria, whereas women and other marginalized folk tend to only apply for those jobs where they tick every single box. And so the example on the left of the screen is from an actual job description, where they call out this research and encourage folk to apply for the jobs, even though they might not necessarily tick every single box. We see that ethnic diversity is also increasing. So we saw that in 2011, 12 years ago, we already had very diverse labor forces in Australia and New Zealand, but it's becoming more so. So much so that migrant arrivals for New Zealand in 2023 are up by 204%, with 225,000 people coming into the country. The flip side, of course, is that we're also seeing just over 100K people leave New Zealand. And for Australia, there's been an additional 454,000 people added to the population over the last 13 months. So it is going to become incumbent upon organizations to find talent amongst people with different ethnic backgrounds, but additionally to assist these people coming into the countries with their onboarding so that they successfully assimilate to Australian and New Zealand working cultures. So, underrepresented groups continue to face barriers when trying to advance in their careers. There is a lack of sponsorship and network opportunities, which organizations just can do something about to a certain extent, but there's also bias in the selection, development, and promotion processes. And even when underrepresented groups do manage to find their way to the top, they continue to face bias, as people's implicit theories of leadership mean that people see leaders as looking, acting, and being a certain way. I just want to share some research with you that was done by, the first one was done by the Macquarie Business School. And they found that you had a better chance of becoming CEO in an Australian organization if you were born in the UK, US, or Canada, as opposed to if you were a second-generation Australian national. So this means that organizations are choosing migrants over nationals to lead due to their ethnic backgrounds. Another example of barriers that minorities face due to unconscious bias is a study that was published in the Leadership Quarterly earlier this year. And this study found that when folks apply for leadership positions, applicants with English names received just under 27% positive responses for their application, while applicants with non-English names received just over 11% positive responses. And so essentially this means that ethnic minorities received 57% fewer positive responses than applicants with English names, despite having identical resumes. So these barriers start early on for people from underrepresented backgrounds. It starts at the selection process and is likely to follow them for the rest of their careers. And unfortunately, cultural priorities are still abound and hidden ceilings exist for many in the workforce due to conscious and unconscious bias. But it isn't all doom and gloom. There is a light at the end of the tunnel by way of personality assessments, because we know that personality assessments generally don't differentiate between different groups like race, ethnicity, sex, gender, age, etc. And this is why having a validated and reliable personality assessment is a great tool to use as part of your selection and development processes. But I'll hand over to Anne-Marie at this point to talk us through this in more detail.
So you might wonder, what does personality has to do with fairness in the workplace, and why should we use Hogan's personality assessments as a tool to promote fairness in organization? Psychometric assessments have a long history of making critical decisions across the employee life cycle, and this is from selection to development. These assessments measure characteristics linked to higher performance. However, their impact on people's lives, especially those from underrepresented groups, can be twofold. So on one hand, assessment can perpetuate bias and unfair discrimination, favoring dominant groups and hindering DE&I efforts. Let's take, for example, cognitive abilities. We know that higher cognitive abilities is associated with higher performance at work. However, for the same level of cognitive abilities, cognitive tests often yield higher results for men than women or for white than people of color, unfairly limiting opportunities for those people in higher level roles. So back to why personality and why Hogan. Personality assessments such as Hogan provide a good alternative to that. They also predict job performance, but without meaningful differences across genders, racial groups, or other underrepresented categories. Let's take an example, ambition, which we know is an important predictor of success in leadership roles. Our research shows that women, racial minorities, and other groups are just as likely to score high or low as their counterparts. And this means that Hogan's personality assessment offers a fair and unbiased approach to identifying strong performer, high potential individuals, and effective leaders, irrespective of their demographics. Thank you, Des. So a quick introduction to our personality assessments for those of us who doesn't know us. Hogan's personality inventories provide a unique approach to personality assessment by focusing on how others perceive our behavior rather than how we perceive ourselves. So we measure reputation rather than identity. And this reputational perspective is really crucial because the impact we have in the workplace is often more closely aligned with how others observe us rather than our own self-perceptions or our own self-beliefs about ourselves. We have 3 core assessments which provide a really comprehensive portrait of someone's personality. So the HPI measures your everyday or bright side personality traits that we say at Hogan. So it assesses your typical behavior and how you present yourself when you're at your best. The HDS evaluates the dark side of your personality. It looks at your potential weaknesses, limitation, or overused strength that may emerge under stress or when you become complacent, and that can derail your career. And finally, the MVPI assesses your core values, interests, and motives. It explores what drives you and what you find meaningful, what you will prioritize in your work and life, but also what sort of culture you strive to create when you are a leader. So we'll pop in the chat our scales and definitions so you can refer back to them when needed later on. Why fairness and why Hogan? Well, Hogan is guided by a fundamental mission to empower individuals and organizations with data-driven talent insights for success. And really at the heart of this mission lies the belief that success should be attainable by everyone and not limited to only a privileged few. Because of this, we take tons of proactive efforts to improving the predictive accuracy of our assessments while also minimizing any potential biases our assessments may have. However, simply stating this commitment to minimizing bias and discrimination is not enough for us, and we take really great pride in openly showcasing our work and elevating the global discussion on this topic. So let's have a look at 3 fundamental questions you should not be shy to ask any test providers if fairness is important for you. And I recommend these questions because these covers areas that are really in the circle of control of your test provider. So first question, how do you define assessment fairness? People and companies can see fairness differently. When you ask the test maker what fairness means to them, it just makes sure that everyone is on the same page there about what's fair in their test. The idea of fairness affects how they will make their tests as well, and whether they think about any unfairness for certain groups of people or not. And so knowing their definition really helps you figure out if their tests are made to be fair in this way. Second question is, how do you prevent or mitigate adverse impact in your assessments? And here I've provided you with even more like sub-questions if you want to be more specific. And these questions really help you understand what practical steps they take. And finally, last one, and I think this one is probably the most important one, but can you demonstrate assessment fairness for diverse groups? So it's perfectly acceptable to request from your test provider that they provide evidence to support their claims, and asking for evidence ensures that their assessments are reliable, valid, fair, and also aligned with your organization's goals and standards. So what we'll do next is we'll look at what Hogan's answers are to those questions, and I'll also flag some of the things you don't want to hear or that you would want to kind of dig a little bit deeper if you hear those questions. So how do we define assessment fairness? So fairness of psychological assessment can be defined as equal opportunity for all the test takers to demonstrate their true performance on the measured construct. So if we take our example that we used earlier with ambition, a fair psychometric test evaluating ambition will yield identical scores for individuals with the same level of ambition, regardless of whether they are male or female. And so that means a test would be unfair if the test results in lower scores due to someone's demographics rather than because of their level of ambition. A couple of examples of inappropriate answers to this question would be not having a clear definition or one that is overly vague, an answer that completely ignores the potential for their assessment to have bias or adverse impact on underrepresented groups, very generic statement without explaining how this is practically implemented. And the last one that really worries me is if the test provider is deflecting responsibility. So if the test provider shifts the responsibility completely for defining fairness to the organizations or suggests that fairness is subjective and can vary from one context to another, this could be indicative that your test provider hasn't been too concerned about whether or not their assessments are fair and free from bias. Question 2, how do you prevent or mitigate adverse impact in your assessments? Before I jump into what Hogan does to prevent adverse impact, I think it's good to understand what could contribute to adverse impact in a psychometric assessment. So I think many people are not aware of the numerous small things that can add up and negatively affect individuals who undergo assessments. From an input perspective, items, translation, and even the assessment experience can contribute to an assessment having adverse impact. For example, some items could be more easily understood by a group of people, causing different groups to score differently. Items can also become outdated with time. Translation errors and lack of cultural adaptation of translated items can also cause different groups to score differently, even though they have the same level of personality trait in themselves. And even if all of your items are perfectly unbiased, the lack of accommodation for individuals with disabilities can also have adverse impact. So for example, if the test can only be completed by reading items on a computer, it may present accessibility challenges for individuals who have visual impairments. So these individuals may not be able to access the content or complete the assessment effectively because they cannot use appropriate accommodations such as screen readers. So what do we do at Hogan to prevent and mitigate those adverse impact or to tackle on these different factors? So for our items, well, we check if our items are equivalent for different groups. For example, if we take the item, I know why stars twinkle, do people of different ethnicities, gender, backgrounds, ages, and even languages answer this question in similar way? So this is something that we will check. We also update our items, either when items get flagged in our own analysis or when test takers provide feedback to us that certain items are becoming a bit outdated. For translation, we follow a very rigorous translation and adaptation process when we add in new languages. So this starts with selecting qualified translators using a back translation method and piloting items before we launch them, and then running analysis to check if indeed the translated items are equivalent to the original set of items. So I can share an example of an adaptation we did for countries in which alcohol consumption is not part of their culture. So one of our original items is, I don't trust anyone who doesn't drink. And this isn't appropriate to ask in a culture where alcohol consumption is not part of day-to-day life. And so we changed that item to, I don't trust anyone who doesn't enjoy having a good time. So this is just an example of how we adapt our items. They might be different items, but here really they capture the same construct. I can also give you an example for language equivalency when we translated our assessment to Japanese. So one of our original items is, I take pride in my work. And in most markets, close to 99% of people will endorse this item. But when we translated this item to Japanese and we tested it before deploying it, we found that only 40% of Japanese would endorse it. So what we did is we worked with our Japanese distributor to understand what the issue was, and we ultimately changed it to "I find meaning in my work." And so now we have an equivalent, two items that are equivalent in terms of language. And finally, for assessment experience, we offer an accessibility portal that is WCAG compliant, so test takers can use a screen reader, and our personality assessments are also on time. So this provides the opportunity for test takers to take breaks if needed. So we just had a look at the input perspective. From the output perspective, well, many other factors can also contribute to having adverse impact. For example, outdated or non-representative norms can be an issue. If you benchmark people's answers on a normative sample dating back from the 80s based on male undergraduate students, this might be problematic. There are no regulations here, but best practice is to use norms that are no older than 10 years old and that are composed of the target population assessed. Total scale and multi-scale scores can also be biased against a group, which could result in systematically under-predicting performance for certain groups if those scales and those multi-scale scores are used to taking decision for selection or development. And then the interpretative text in reports can also be biased or be outdated, unnecessarily perpetuating stereotypes or prejudice. So there are many things that an assessment provider can do to address those issues. And one thing that we do at Hogan is, thank you, Des, is so we update our normative samples regularly. So we just released our 2023 norms, which is composed of workers who took our assessments between 2018 and 2022. And gender representative was increased 8 points with a ratio of 46% women and 54% men. And our global norm also includes people from 190 markets speaking 48 different languages and dialects. So this is really what we want to see for in terms of global norms. We also have 39 different local norms if you want to benchmark people against the local job market. And recent normative samples are really important to use here because they are more likely to reflect current population, including changes in demographics, cultural factors, and social norms. It also ensures that the assessment scores remain accurate and relevant for the target population. And we also know that assessments based on recent and representative normative samples tend to have better predictive validity. So here, what we're really doing is we want to be more likely to accurately predict performance and behavior in real-world situations. For scales and multi-scale scores, I won't go too much into details because Alice will be able to share more about that. But we check for equivalency across groups, and we run proactive simulations to monitor for adverse impact, especially for our selection report. We also offer custom research services for organizations that wants to check for adverse impact with their own data. And for interpretative tests, we will update our interpretative text in our report. So something we did in recent years is just an example, but if test takers have the option of selecting which gender they identify to, and they also have the option of selecting no gender when they complete our tests. And so if they choose the women gender, then in our reports it will be feminine pronouns. But if they select no gender, pronouns used in reports will be they. Finally, there are even more preventative measures we take. When I say we really care about fairness at Hogan, I really mean it. So a couple of other preventative measures we take is we follow industry-leading guidelines and best practices when developing our tech manuals and reports. And we also document our research and make it easily available. We'll also submit it to third-party reviewers to get their feedback and make sure that we meet industry standards. We stay informed, and we also contribute to advancing what others are doing by being actively involved in IO psychology and test publisher associations. And most importantly, we work with our local partners such as PBC. Some of the results Alice will show you actually comes from concerns or questions that were raised from Australian and New Zealand clients. And I saw a couple of ones already pop in the chat. So Alice will be able to answer some of those questions. So our last question here is, can you demonstrate assessment fairness for diverse groups? So we discussed many factors and preventative measures a test provider can implement, but the most important question you might want to ask is, can you actually walk the talk and demonstrate assessment fairness for diverse groups? And to answer this question, assessment providers have in-house experts like Elise to identify which analysis we should use, what are the latest innovation in terms of those analyses or the process that we need to follow, and how to interpret results. So Elise, I'm asking you the question, can we demonstrate that Hogan's assessment are fair for diverse groups? And if so, how do you do so?
Thank you. So yes, we can demonstrate this. And one way we do this is by doing an equivalency analysis. And this is to check for assessment equivalence. So if we can demonstrate that different groups respond the same ways to the assessment items, we can ensure our assessment items are functioning equivalently and not discriminating against different groups in the population. If we see that different groups are responding differently to an assessment question or item, then we know there's a problem and we can change the item to ensure that we're measuring all groups equivalently. Equivalence is important for several reasons. When we establish equivalence, it allows us to show that our assessments are fair across different groups. It helps us to ensure when we're using our assessments for selection that we're selecting only on job relevant characteristics. It allows us to confidently compare mean scores across groups. And then it helps us to identify any items that we might want to review or revise. Next slide, please. Thank you. So our approach to equivalence is extremely thorough. We use 5 main statistics, and I won't go into too much detail on these, but if you're a statistics nerd like me and you want to dig deeper, then please feel free to contact PBC and they can help share our detailed process with you. But when we did the research for this study looking at groups in Australia and New Zealand, we were pleased but not surprised to find that all the results demonstrate that all the differences in internal consistencies between groups are negligible and all congruence coefficients are above the recommended threshold. So this gives us evidence that our assessments are equivalent across identity groups. We also examined differential item functioning, which looks at if there are differences in the ways how an individual answers specific questions or items on the assessment. And if there are no differences in how individuals across different groups score on the assessment, then we know that the item is functioning fairly. So in a moment, we'll share more information on differential test functioning, which looks at if there are differences in how individuals are scoring on scales. And a scale is made up of multiple items. So the lower the differential test functioning, the more equivalent the scale scores are. So now I'm going to talk about our methodology for this study and our results. I wanted to quickly show the sample size for each group demographic we analyzed, and for the reference group, which was European. We require at least 500 people to conduct these analyses. And as you can see, the Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander group and the North African or Middle Eastern group are below that 500 threshold. So I did include the results, but they're tentative for now, and I wouldn't put full confidence in them until we gather at least 500 people in each group. And then for Pacific peoples, you can also see that that's below the 500 person threshold. But since it was substantially lower, even below the 400 mark, I haven't yet done preliminary analyses for this group. So we hope to be able to do so in the coming future. So these graphs are looking at mean scale scores on the core 3 assessments, the HPI, the HDS, and the MVPI across Australian racial and ethnic groups. So as you can see here, there's a lot of overlap in the lines. They're extremely similar. We don't see any practically meaningful differences in these groups. And then this is the same mean differences in the New Zealand racial and ethnic groups. So again, we see a lot of overlap, a lot of similarity. You can see a pattern of Asian New Zealanders scoring slightly higher on average, but even the largest mean difference on any one scale is a 3-point difference on a scale of 0 to 100. So now we're going to discuss a statistical method called differential test functioning. This helps us understand how different groups perform on a personality assessment. So in this case, we looked at Australian and New Zealand racial ethnic groups and then compared how they responded on our core assessments. So the DTF analysis is a way to see if the test behaves differently for these two groups. And you can imagine if you had a scale that was used to measure the weight of different fruits, for example, apples, oranges, bananas, and let's say that scale consistently shows that apples are heavier than oranges and bananas, even though you know they weigh the same. The difference in how the scale measures these fruits might indicate a problem with how it's assessing each fruit's weight. So this is similar to how, or what we look for with differential test functioning. So we're looking for if a test is consistently measuring one group of people differently from one another, even if they should perform the same. And then in this table, we use a metric that's called signed percent DTF. And this essentially tells us the extent of the difference between two groups. So a percentage less than 5% indicates a very minimal, almost negligible difference. And in fact, across all the scales and comparisons we made between the Australian and New Zealand racial and ethnic groups, this difference was consistently less than 5%. So what does this mean? It suggests that the personality assessment in the context of our study is behaving similarly for both Australian and New Zealand ethnic groups. So in simpler terms, both groups approached and answered the questions on the test in a very comparable manner. And the test was measuring them in a comparable manner. So even though the two groups are from different backgrounds, their responses on the personality assessment were so similar that statistically we consider the test to be equivalent for both groups. And this is an important finding because it suggests that the assessment is equivalent and isn't biased towards any one group. And it allows us to draw meaningful and fair conclusions about personality traits across these ethnicities. And this is just a summary slide to say that we did these analyses across all of our assessments and we found the same results. All of the scores on the signed DTF were less than 5%, indicating that all three core assessments were fair across all ethnic groups assessed.
Alice, can I ask you a question before you jump to this slide? So just earlier, we saw that New Zealander with an Asian background scored a bit higher on the MVPI scale. So my understanding is the first thing we do is we look at mean score differences, and then we'll investigate further with the DTF analysis. Is that correct?
Yes. So the first step in an analysis is to examine, are there mean differences between these two groups? However, it's important to dig deeper and understand why are there mean differences. So is it the test that is measuring one group different from one another? And that's what we did with the DTF analysis. So we determined that the test is measuring, ambition or excitable the same for Asian and European people in New Zealand. But we do see slightly higher group scores for Asian people on a couple scales. But as I mentioned, the largest difference that we see is a 3-point difference. So although the lines are a little different, it's practically not a huge difference.
Mm-hmm. And I think when we had explored those results together, it's basically it's likely due to a difference in personality traits rather in our sample rather than the demographics in our New Zealand sample. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we do tend to assess more people who are in managerial and executive positions. And the biggest scale score difference we saw, the 3-point difference, was on the BOLD scale, which is really predictive of leadership success. So I think that's also a factor to consider when looking at these results.
Thanks.
Thank you. So this table just shows some additional analyses that we've conducted on the US sample and a global sample. So we have looked at gender, age, US race and ethnicity categories, sexual orientation, and then intersectional identities. So that's gender and race ethnicity combinations. So like white women, for example. And we found the same results. We found no evidence of differential test functioning, very, very small mean differences, so no practically meaningful differences there. And then we also looked at our 39 language and dialect translations of our assessment as compared to the original US assessment. And again, we saw really promising results indicating that we are in fact measuring the same personality traits in all the languages. So we know that the Hogan assessments are fair from an input perspective, but we wonder, do we see any significant differences in how different groups, including genders or ages or ethnicities, score on the assessments? So when we use the assessments as part of a selection process, we also must guarantee that there's no predictive bias, that we're not creating selection criteria that favors one group over another. And so to do this, we recommend conducting adverse impact analyses. Adverse impact is a legal term in the US. It refers to an instance where selection procedures fail to hire one protected group at a similar rate as a dominant group. A lot of other countries have very similar constructs. It's important to note that organizations must conduct their own analyses to examine adverse impact on their applicant pool, because there's several parts of a selection system that could contribute to adverse impact beyond just the assessment itself. However, Hogan does these as part of our off-the-shelf selection reports, so we can confirm that our selection recommendations do not contribute to adverse impact. And so these graphs show adverse impact simulations on our off-the-shelf reports. So configure, the top graph, is just a competency-based report. EQ is a personality-based measure of emotional intelligence. And then Express is a personality-based job family selection tool. So adverse impact simulations analyze archival data to see if historically one group would be selected or recommended at a substantially higher rate than another group. When we talk about cut scores, we're essentially talking about the minimum score needed to pass an assessment or test. In our analysis, we use simulated cut scores to create hypothetical pass or fail thresholds. And the goal was to ensure that our assessments don't cause adverse impact for race, age, or gender. We analyzed the performance of different groups who took these assessments to see if any particular group seemed to be at a disadvantage compared to others. The standard in the field of equal employment opportunity is known as the 4/5 rule. So this rule is a guideline used to measure potential discrimination in a selection process. And it states that if the selection rate for a particular group is less than 80% or 4/5 of the rate of the group with the highest selection rate, that there might be evidence of adverse impact or potential discrimination. So in our analyses, we discovered that all of our off-the-shelf products, when assessed across different races, ages, and genders, met the 4/5 rule. So what that means is that the pass rates for each group, whether categorized by race, age, or gender, were at least 80% of the highest performing group. These findings indicate that our assessments did not exhibit evidence of adverse impact among different groups. So in simpler terms, it suggests that no specific group had an advantage or disadvantage in their performance on our assessments. And then this result is essential because it confirms that our assessments don't display significant differences among various groups based on race, age, or gender when taking the test. And then these graphs show the additional off-the-shelf products that we examined. So general employability is a high volume entry-level selection tool, leader in sales basis or leader in salesperson selection reports, and then high potential is a report meant for development of leaders and future leaders. And then safety is a report that can be used to examine how likely individuals are to adhere to safety rules. So again, these graphs show that all of the lines are above the 0.8 line, indicating no evidence that our assessments would cause adverse impact. So this research provides a strong body of evidence that indicates the equivalence and fairness of the Hogan assessments in terms of both the assessments themselves and the implications of the assessment use. There's a type of validity that many psychologists learn about called Messick's consequential validity, and this concerns both the intentional and unintentional consequences of an assessment. And I think this is one of the most important validities to consider when selecting an assessment provider. And it's important to consider if your assessment is making the world a better and more fair place. And at Hogan, we pride ourselves on being socially responsible and conducting ongoing and transparent research. And I think these results are a really good example of this. So I'll hand it back to Anne-Marie.
Thank you so much, Elise, and thank you for doing the analysis on the Australian and New Zealand racial ethnicities. I know this is something we always get asked in Australia and New Zealand. Are Hogan's assessments fair for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, or same for Maori and Pacific people? So thank you so much for doing that. This is something that we care a lot here. So a couple of final thoughts. So first one, while we increase our focus on diversity, it's important to remember that different groups face barriers to entry, especially earlier on in their careers. So for example, being identified as a potential good leader merely due to explicit and implicit biases. Number two, Hogan works proactively to ensure our personality assessment perform as effectively as possible while reducing unfair discrimination. And something I'd like you to take away is how using a reliable and fair personality assessment actually offers you a good alternative and a good tool for combating these biases to choose diverse candidates best suited for roles in the organization. Number three, Hogan assessments differentiate candidates based on their personality characteristic and not based on their demographic characteristic. And this is something that you would want to have evidence for as well in any test or psychometric test assessment you would be using. Number four, and last one, don't shy away from asking tough questions to your assessment providers. And I really hope that the information we provided today about our work, the work we do at Hogan, has contributed to your understanding and critical perspective on the fairness of psychometric assessment, and that you are now better equipped to ask some tough questions to your assessment provider and evaluate the quality of their answer. So thank you, Elise. Thank you, Des. I think now we'll jump to questions.
Yeah, Kapai, thank you very much, Anne-Marie and Elise. We had a couple of questions come through just in terms of the fairness for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and those have pretty much been answered. And Marty for Māori as well, and obviously we're actively working on Pacifica and getting the results from them. We have a question in terms of, could you provide any information on the accessibility portal?
Yes, I know we just did an audit of our accessibility portal to make sure. So some of the things that we're looking for when we have a WCAG compliant accessibility portal is to make sure that the text is easy to read, and so someone could use a screen reader to instead of having to use the computer purely, we can use other alternative or accommodation to complete the assessment in another way. I don't have many details, but please send us an email, and I'm happy to provide you with all the specific details about our accessibility portal.
And then we've got a question, Elise, this one might be for you, is how do your cognitive tests mitigate for cultural fairness, particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders?
So we haven't tested the equivalence of the HBRI or the Hogan Business Reasoning Inventory yet, but that's something I would love to do. What I can say is that the test contains business reasoning items, so they're not culturally relevant. They're face neutral, so things that regard, scheduling or simple math problems. So they don't contain cultural content, but I would be interested in analyzing the equivalence of those in the future.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, we will be sharing the slides, and any other questions. Greg, you had a slide about the charts, or a question about the charts in particular. Happy to share more information on the research that was included as part of this presentation. And if you have any other questions, we're happy to follow up and answer those directly. But yep, those seem to be all of our questions for today. So thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, PBC, and special thank you to PBC's marketing team as well, who really helped us put together and pull together this webinar. And thank you, Elise, for staying up late. We really appreciate what you do at Hogan and the fact that you could join us in our time zone. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and this was great.
Cheers, everyone.